Thank you for your kind words of introduction. It reminds me of the story of a man who was introduced to speak at an insurance convention, and he was introduced as a man who had made $50 million in the stock market in the United Kingdom or somewhere in New York, I guess. And he stood up and said, I just want to make a few corrections. It wasn't in New York, it was in Chicago. So number two, it wasn't 50 million, it was 100 million. Number three, it wasn't made, it was lost. Number four, it wasn't me, it was my brother. You hear all these nice accolades, so kind of you to say all of that, but thank you so much. All I can really lay claim to is that I'm married to Marty. We do have 3 children and 5 grandchildren, and they are the pride and joy of my life. हम तो दिल्ली वाले हैं, चेन्नई में पैदा हुए थे, लेकिन भारत से गए हुए 50 साल हो गए, वो 50 years have gone by. I moved first to Toronto and then after that on to New York, where I did a professorship, and now we live in Atlanta, Georgia. We've been there for about 33 years. All of my family lives right there now. I'm traveling with also the 2 of my colleagues, Sanj Kalra, who was also born in Delhi, but was only 1 year old when his parents moved into Ottawa, Canada, where he did his studies as a very brilliant tennis player in Akron, Ohio, and then went into the medical sales business and now has joined our team. An amazing testimony. Michael Suleiman, one of my young colleagues, an amazing young man, already with a lot of promise, makes his home in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of bridges towards those in government and those in those areas of bastions of power. He has a wonderful message to take to them. But most importantly, I know God who knows everybody, and then I know Charles Mendes who knows almost everybody. Charles Mendes, and that's right at the back. Our friendship goes back many, many years, and every now and then he sort of drop an idea, hey, come to Nepal sometime, come to Nepal sometime. So I took it up on it, and we're here, and we've been here for 3 days. But Everest was not eager to meet us, so we will have to wait for another visit before we see those majestic peaks above the clouds. But we had great conversations waiting for the weather to clear. So I've just written an article called Watching and Waiting. The thing is not just to get there, the thing is you got to get there, you'll come back. And that's what life is all about, not just to get here, but to find out what you're going to do when you make your exit. So Charles and Susan had, hey, thanks guys, you've done an amazing job for hosting. The only downside is I didn't do enough clothes. Well, the food they've given us, I don't fit anywhere. So next time a visit to the tailor as we in would be very much in order. We're on a multiple country trip. From here tomorrow I'll go to Delhi, and Delhi on to Cochin on to Colombo, Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka on to Oxford, where we do an annual lectureship every July with my teammates. I'm just doing a couple of them. The rest of them are already there. But it's been wonderful to be here in Kathamandu. I've never been here before. Heard so much about your beautiful country, and really I don't say that lightly. You have an amazingly beautiful country. And you look around and see the hills and see the handiwork of God in all that He's given to you in this beauty. It's a trust, and it's a trust to be taken care of and guarded and preserved. The mountains speak of His splendor, and the valleys talk of the time, how He takes you through, regardless of whether you're high or low. I remember when I was a kid, meeting Tenzing Norgay. He came to our school in Delhi, and I shook hands with him and greeted him. At that time, all I knew was that he climbed Mount Everest, which is something I could never do. I was watching the circus once, and I looked at my wife and I said, the only job fit for me here is the guys who follow the elephants. But even that I can't do with a broken back. So if you have all the Sherpas that can help me, I'll get to base camp, I guess, someday and just have a meal out there. Thank you for welcoming us. Thank you for hosting us. I was a little nervous about my voice because I don't know whether it's the air quality or what it is I've been inhaling, but it's been a bit rough for 2 days. So this is the first time hearing my own voice. I thought if I speak for a few minutes before I get into my message, I'll test it out to make sure that I'm doing okay. So thank you so much. Thank you very much. I hope you will come back someday. We'd like to. like to see those beautiful peaks closer at hand. Otherwise, the people will say, we sent you there to bring back some pictures, and why do you not come back? So we'll do it sometime. You know, my wife and I, in the course of getting a home, we've come to that stage in life where you move to what you think will be your last stop before you make your heavenward journey. And very close to where we were shopping for a home, there happens to be a man who bought a very, very magnificent piece of property. It's like a castle out there. You drive past it and you say, wow. He's a well-known basketball player, made all his money and millions, and you stare at the house, but if you look very carefully, the house is stilted like that. He spent millions on it, now he's having a hard time selling it. Nobody wants to buy it, because they built a flawed foundation. The foundation could not withstand all the luxury that he put on there, and in the back part of the house, I've not even been there, but my wife, she's a sleuth. She loves to get around everywhere. So she wanted to go, but they told her she couldn't get to the back of the house because it's already cracking. The foundation is breaking below there. You can have a magnificent infrastructure, an elaborate superstructure, but if you don't have a foundation to hold it all, it will collapse someday. Many years ago, I was speaking at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And actually, I was with one or two very fine philosophers that were also doing the speaking, and as I was being driven to the venue by my host, a businessman, he stopped outside the building, and he said, this is America's first postmodern building. It's called the Rexner Center for the Arts. I said, what is a postmodern building? I know postmodern philosophy, but what is a postmodern building? He said, well, the architect believed, since life has no design and purpose, why should our buildings have a design and purpose? So if you build a house with staircases going nowhere, rooms of all shapes that can accommodate nothing, and all of this is a center for the arts by the Rexner Foundation, or named after them anyway. I don't know if they funded it or what. So he said, what do you think about that, the postmodern building? I said, did he do the same with the foundation? And then just smiled. I said, did City Hall give him permission to build a foundation that is serving purpose? Or did the foundation have to meet certain specs? See, all the things we do for outward show can only go so far. What will withstand the storms and testings of life will really have to be the foundation on which you have built your entire infrastructure, or whatever it is you ultimately value. We pay so little heed to foundations and so much detail to the aesthetics, and when life moves along, we find out that we're really living in a very hollow structure. If you were to ask me to give one word to describe the cultures of our time, it would be that word, hollow. It is empty for most people. Okay, it's empty in the middle, completely empty. You know, when a guy is really making a big deal of himself, in Hindi you used to say, "Popikari." You know, popikari. Come on, false arrogance. It was not real. And so the question about life is, what does it take to build a strong, a certain foundation, so that when the storms and the winds blow and the rains come and all that threatens it, it will stand. What does it take to have that kind of a life? You know, in 1946, the humanist Aldous Huxley, in his book Ends and Means, made this comment. That was brilliant. Ends and means. Ultimately, we all have an end in sight, and we have means to get to that end. Life boils down to ends and means. And he said, we are living today not in the delicious intoxication of the early successes of science, rather in the grisly morning after, where it has become quite apparent that what science may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends. What science has actually done is to introduce us to good means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or rather deteriorated ends. Indian said, Acharya Vinod Bhave made the comment, he said, in the pre-modern world, violence would be relative. In the modern world, he said, violence would become an absolute. How right he was. It's the only absolute for some people. If you can bully them into submission, if you can exploit a weaker nation or a weaker brother, press them under, and become the top dog at the end of it all. Ends and means. What is the end to which you live, the purpose for which you live? That is for a completely different message on a different day. I want to talk to you today about building a foundation. I might just take that extra bottle of water in here. It's getting raspy, I'm afraid. Thank you. If we want to know what those pillars are, the foundation that we must build for the future, we have to think this through very, very carefully. The psalmist cried out at one point, he said, if the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? If the foundations are being destroyed. You know, we stay in a beautiful hotel out here, one of your historic hotels. And in the front hall, you have a sign of the founder. He said he wanted to preserve heritage and culture. First heritage, then culture. That's actually brilliant. It's chronological and logical. You have to know from whence you have come. And then you have to know what values to really preserve. In America, we've forgotten that. We no longer think about heritage. We no longer think about the past. And he who refuses to learn from history, said Santayana, is forced to repeat its mistakes. You have to find what is the foundation on which you will build. And I would like to give you four pillars that must form that foundation. If you put these four pillars in the right places and build your values and ethics on those four pillars, you will find that the storms and the winds and the rains will not pull them down. The first is the pillar of eternity. You don't live for the moment. You live for that which is eternal. You know, the fact of the matter is, intuitively, whether we like to admit it or not, intuitively, we lunge towards the eternal. We use terms that talk about a tomorrow, that there will be some hope beyond the 3 years and 10, some hope beyond the grave, that will really define everything for you and for me. In our language, we think about it. For example, here in 1968, I just moved to Canada in 66. I was 20 years old at that time. It was Christmas Eve, I believe, and my family and I had just come back from church, that included my parents, and we just come back from a long evening on that night, and my father wanted us to sit down and watch a television program because he said something historic is happening. So we turned the television on, and what was that historic event? It was the event of the astronauts going down the dark side of the moon, being given a glimpse that no human eye had ever been given before. They saw Earth rise over the horizon of the moon, draped in a beauteous mixture of blue and white, garlanded by the glistening light of the sun. Philosopher of science, Arthur Peacock, I believe, used those words to describe that moment. Draped in a beauteous mixture of blue and white, garlanded by the glistening light of the sun against the black void of space. He said, you're all in the throes of what the first words were going to be. So they take a glimpse of this tiny little speck coming over the horizon of the moon, a speck they call Earth and home. And then there was crackling and there was silence, and the first words from tens of thousands of miles away, in the beginning, God. The astronaut said he had not rehearsed that at all. He had not given a thought to what he was going to say when he was confronted by that awe-inspiring sight of this magnificent universe and this place called home, to speak to humanity for the first time, a voice coming from space. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But only God was big enough to encompass the emotion and all that he was feeling. No poet could have explained it. No philosopher could have explained it. No lyricist could have done justice to it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You see, intuitively, he moved towards a phrase that was the only thing that could capture something bigger than us, something bigger than ourselves. C.S. Lewis says we do the same thing with the word time. We look at a young person and say, my, how he's grown. My, how time flies. He says this happens all the time and we keep repeating ourselves. My, how he's grown. My, how time flies. My son Nathan is taller than I am. He just get tired of people who see him after years and say, my, how he's grown. He said, why do you keep saying that? They should have been shocked if I hadn't grown. But growth is so natural and normal and yet so surprising to us. My, how he's grown. My, how she's grown. My, how time flies. He said it would be like fish complaining constantly or remarking constantly at the wetness of water. Oh, how wet this is. He said that would be surprising indeed, unless we know that one day the fish was intended to live on dry land. And for us, we keep saying, my, how time flies. My, how how he's grown. Because, as Lewis, we are intended to live in eternity. Time perpetually seems a surprising novelty to us, because this is not what we are intended to live with constantly. Lewis puts it this way. In speaking of the desire for our own far-off country which we find in ourselves, even now I feel a certain shyness. I'm almost admitting an indecency. I'm trying to open for you the inconsolable secret in each one of you. The secret which hurts so much that you take revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. The secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when in very intimate conversation the mention of it becomes imminent, we grow awkward and affect to laugh at ourselves. The secret we cannot hide but cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because it's a desire for something that has never actually happened in our experience. We cannot hide it because our experience is constantly suggesting it, and we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of the word heaven. The moment you mention the word heaven, he said there's an awkwardness about it, almost like a lover betraying something very secretive. We cannot hide it, and yet we cannot completely describe it. We're always longing for that city that we have never been to, the flower we have never smelled, the taste we have never experienced, the relationship we have never ultimately had. But just think of stepping on shore and finding it heaven, of touching a hand and finding it God's hand, and breathing new air and finding it celestial, of waking up in glory and finding it home. The words of that beautiful gospel. We all lunge towards it. Eternity. That is the existential side of it. But let me point out a philosophical side of it. What if there is no eternity? What if 70 years and 10 is all that we have assigned that we have done? Lying there, rotting in the grave. What if that's all there is to it? Think of the greatest longing today of the average person. What is it we hear so often? Justice, justice, justice. If there is no eternity, there is no justice. Because the unjust and the power-driven triumph, and the victimized and the weak are silenced, brutalized by such exploits of power. There is a tomorrow. There is the day that dawns in which all the balances are set straight. This is not just fictional thinking. This was the whole point of the resurrection. The entire reality of Christ conquering the grave. And that's why the gospel writer says that Christ be not risen from the dead, our entire faith is in vain. And that word vain means empty, hollow. There's nothing beyond. If Christ be not risen from the dead, the judge of all the earth shall do that which is right, says the scripture writers. Solomon, who lived with so much of theoretical knowledge and so little practical wisdom, he made this comment in the 3rd chapter. He said, God has put eternity into the heart of man, and yet we cannot fathom the beginning from the end. Your heart has that eternity in it, that eternal perspective in it. I lost my parents when I was relatively young. My mother I lost when I was in my 20s. 5 years after my mother died. She was 57. My dad died 5 years after that. So very quickly you realize your parents have gone on and you're just starting at the peak of your life. But you have no father or mother to go back to and tell them all the wonderful stories that have just happened that day. Just think of how futile life is if that's all there is to it. Set your sights not on just today, but on the eternal. One day I sat down and wrote this and I said, the way this world is going, now is all we seem to have. And like a trapped animal we crawl away behind a curtain. Truth has been relegated to technology. Beauty subjugated to the beholder. Goodness is mocked as millions and millions are hypnotized in front of a box every night. We have become manipulated entities in a disposable world. We have become fragmented quantities in a disjointed world. Manipulated entities in a disposable world. Fragmented quantities in a disjointed world where you live only for the now. Whatever you're holding in your hand is a phone, 3 years from now will be an antique. They look at you and say, what's the matter with you? You're still using this, it's so old right now. Things are moving at such a fast pace, even when you are holding what you consider as new. The technocrats are already planning to make it old within a matter of months. That's the way life goes. Everything new, everything new. And so you fall in love and it's new. And it's wonderful. But the real beauty of love is not watching two 25-year-olds holding hands and walking, but two 85-year-olds holding hands and walking, who've proven the destiny. That's the reality. Time flies. My, how we grow. But everything remains in an eternal perspective. Keep that pillar ever before you. When you ask the question, what happens when I die? That question has to be answered for you, and that's the true value when you get the divine accolade. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Every time I go to Delhi, I take a taxi and I go to the Prithviraj Road Cemetery because I was 9 years old when my grandmother died. I don't remember much about it except that it was a bright sunny day. And I remember standing there by the grave as the coffin was lowered and just trying to figure it all out. And the thing that I remembered most was the hymn that they sang, Abide with me, fast falls the eventide, the darkness deepens, Lord with me abide. Swift to its close, and dead's not life's little day. Earth's joys grow dim, its glories pass away, change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. God has built you and me for the eternal. That's the first parameter, the dimension of eternity. Second is the dimension of morality. There has to be a moral framework to your thinking and mine. Moral reasoning is a very rare quality these days. I've lived in America now North America for 50 years. I watched that part of the world begin to decay and mangle itself. My colleague Oz Guinness has written a book called The Free People's Suicide. is sort of committing suicide by losing all the values that they once had. What America was known for in the founding of its nation was very different to the rest of Europe. That's exactly what made America a unique experiment. You know what that uniqueness was? For the Europeans, reasoning and rationalism was supreme. You go back to the rationalists, you go to the empiricists, you go to the existentialists, they're all somehow linked to reasoning of some sort. For the American people in the founding of the nation, it wasn't reasoning that was supreme. It was moral reasoning that was supreme. Philosophers are realizing this, that what made that experiment unique was a moral reasoning, but we've lost it now. The last thing you can talk about on a university campus is moral reasoning. They actually don't like either. They don't like to talk about morality. They don't even like for you to talk about reasoning. It's all postmodern with no truth, no meaning, no certainty. Your moral reasoning is that what makes you who you are. How you reason morally. And Jesus gave two of the most brilliant answers on this. You will never find these anywhere else. They first came to test him about spirituality versus the government. Then they tested him on spirituality versus spirituality. So the spirituality and the government, as lawyer, of course, leave it to a lawyer to do this, and he comes up to Jesus and he says, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar? I wish Jesus had said no. Don't pay him any taxes. How wonderful that would be, right? Yeah, of course, a lot of people in India have assumed that anyway. That's where we all go through demonetization and find out that doesn't work either. But he comes to Jesus and says, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar? You know, Jesus was so sharp. Not just that he was divine. He was so practical. He always knew how to answer his questioner. And you know how he answered his questioner? By questioning the questioner first. When you question the questioner, two things happen. It forces the questioner to open up within what he or she is assuming in the question. And number two, it changes the entry point of the discussion. Jesus always determined the entry point of the discussion. Good master, what should I do to attain eternal life? Why do you call me good? And I said, wait a minute, I'm asking you a simple question. Yeah, but what do you mean by good? See, it immediately changes the entry point. So I pay taxes to Caesar. What does Jesus say? Have you got a coin? The man says, yes. He says, give me that coin. So holds the coin, puts it in his hand, and he says, whose image is on this coin? The man says, Caesar. He says, give to Caesar, that which belongs to Caesar. And give to God, that which belongs to God. The man missed his greatest moment. He should have said to Jesus, what belongs to God? And you know what Jesus would have said? Whose image is on you? That's the point. That's the point. You give this earthly mammoth type stuff back to Caesar, it will fade, and Caesar will fade and wither also. I was in Abu Dhabi, and they have all these fake watches. Very genuine, but he was telling me that this was not fake, this was genuine fake. I said, 1 or 2 days will this begin, after some time will this all begin to fade? He looks at me and said, so will you. I said, but I'm not for sale. The whole idea of the image of God and the reality, what is of real value. Jesus gave him a heart and said to him, that which belongs to God, he said, is you are a Margaret Day. The person sitting next to you is as much made in the image of God as you are. Therefore, you have no right to violate them. So the next guy comes along. Okay, you got us last time. Which is the greatest commandment? Pitching law against law. Moses had given 630 laws. David reduced it to 15. Isaiah, I think, to 11. Micah reduced it to 3. To do justice and mercy will come before the God. Which is the greatest one. Jesus could have given him one very easy. He could give him one. Habakkuk did it in one way, we just shall live by faith. Romans says that, Revelation says that, Hebrews says that. He did it right out of Habakkuk and gave it down in one simple proposition. Jesus could have said, we just shall live by faith. He didn't. He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and all your mind and all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the laws and the prophets. You see, they wanted theory. He was giving them the divine imperative of the practical side. You don't just say, I'm loving the Lord my God with all my heart. He said, you better go and love your neighbor as yourself. Because on the basis of the first, the second naturally follows. Without the first, the second has no place to stand foundation. You and I are created in God's image. So here's what I want to say to you. Morality in the biblical sense is very different to any other ethical worldview. First of all, it gives you the vertical before it gives you the horizontal. It gives you the vertical before it gives you the horizontal. But there's something else here. Morality is not your problem and mine. What God has really told us is that our malady is so deep that morality alone cannot solve it. You will never attain perfection by the keeping of the law. Martin Luther was angry with God. In fact, he said he began to hate God because of his demands of righteousness. Till it dawned on him that righteousness and this experience of the Christ is not something that is earned. It is something that's gift. It's a gift. Righteousness is not something you have earned. If you think you have earned it, you will move to pride. If you know you have received it as a gift, it will move you to humility. That's the big difference between the worldview that Christ gives to us and every other worldview which teaches you to earn points, to earn righteousness, to earn morality. I said you cannot do that. You just shall live by faith. By grace are you saved through faith, and not out of yourselves. It is the gift of God. We were out for lunch today and somebody gave us some gifts in Nepal. I never earned it. I never did anything for him to get that gift. But he gave me this gift and he put it in my office and he said, where do you get that from? I'm going to say, well, you know, I just preached a great sermon. I said, got it from a man whom I met for the first time and he gave it to me as a gift. It's good grace. It's good. What a beautiful story you have in following Jesus Christ. Yes. You do not earn your presence with him. He calls you aside and gives it to you as a gift. Mm-hmm. So eternity, morality, thirdly, accountability. And how important is this? Very important. That you and I learn to be accountable. Here's what I want to zero in on and move to my final thought. Here's what I want to say to you. No matter who you are, you always will have moments alone that nobody else knows what you're thinking, what you're doing. No matter who you are. Always have that alone time. Somewhere in life you have that alone time. And the marvelous thing is that God tells us that it's in those alone times He really wants to speak to you. He really wants to hear you to hear His voice. Those alone times you are really not alone. You know, the question is asked in philosophy, if the tree falls in the jungle with nobody there to hear it, does it make a noise? But I mean, ask this question. Where do you come up with a question? There's so many unanswered questions in life, and we want to know if tree falls in the jungle with nobody there to hear it, it doesn't make a noise. So a little poet wrote, there was a young man who thought God must find it exceedingly odd when you see that the tree continues to exist so there's no one about in the court. Young man, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in this court, and that's why this tree shall continue to be. Since observed by yours faithfully, God. God is always observing everything. And so when you're thinking of that, make sure you realize that you live, not as though nobody is watching, but God is always there. Always there. Let me give you a little example of this. How it is that God observes and how it is that God watches. When I was a young man, I was working in the hotel industry. I was only 20 years old, and actually I wasn't even supposed to be working in licensed establishments, so they really didn't need to be responsible. But I just hit that 21-year-old mark, and so I was going through this process of being trained to be a banqueting manager in this hotel and so on. So I used to leave the keys with me for all the expensive liquors, all the expensive liquors. So I stopped hotel. Wonderful place. And I was too naive. I was raised in a very sheltered upbringing and yelling. Well, then, 30 or 12, all these boys would go out. Chef, banqueting manager, and the matron and all. I wonder, all these guys going at night, what's open at midnight when they go home? So I used to go home. And they would keep on prodding me. Come on, go with us one night. Just go with us one night. I didn't know what the boys were up to. All I knew is I needed sleep and I was going to go home. So one day the managing director looked at me and he said, when are you going to become a man? So I looked at him and I said, sir, why did you leave the keys with me to walk up all this expensive stuff at night? Did the random stoop? It was true. I said, tonight did you get me to do something that is against my convictions? Tomorrow will you still leave the key with me? He looked at me and said, I would never ask you again. And I left the hotel industry and was going to theological training in Toronto. I was not a big person, I was just an ordinary employee there. I didn't have a big title. He walked me to the door, he put his arm around me and he said, you are going exactly in the direction of the character for which you are made, for who you are. He said, but Ravi, if you ever change your mind and want to come back, always be there. It's amazing, you know. I wasn't trying to be any great bravado guy. I just knew I didn't want to mess with that kind of thing. Midnight I belonged with my room. I didn't belong with these boys doing whatever they did. I don't know what they were doing. But I didn't belong with that group. Take your stand. Don't be afraid of holding on to your convictions, but do it with grace and do it with gentleness, because you are accountable to Almighty God. You see, the greatest problem in this world that you can think of right now, you can think of numerous problems. You will probably be wrong. Your greatest problem is not out there. My greatest problem is not out there. It's in here. This is what I need to deal with first. I was in Bombay some time ago. Colleague Simon was with me, and at the Taj Mahal Hotel, that beautiful hotel ballroom, I came and talked at the ballroom. There were a lot of high executives there, and the man stood up. And he said to me, I have a question for you. My wife and I have a disagreement. I said, I don't get into wife and husband disagreements. He said, no, I have this question. He said, is a guru necessary? Said, my wife says yes, I say I don't know. What do you think? So I said, sir, the only thing that is ultimately absolutely necessary is that which meets your greatest need, which you cannot meet in any other way. Your greatest need is not for a guru. Your greatest need is for a Savior. And what's more, your guru needs a Savior too. So what I do to you is I present to you a Savior. Say glory to Jesus Christ. If I repeated that illustration so many parts of the world, last time when we were in Mumbai speaking, the gentleman comes up to me and said, "You made me famous all over the world by telling the story that I'm blessed that I asked you." It's true. Oh, we may have great teachers. We all need teachers. In fact, the Jewish saying was, you have your earthly father and then you have your rabbi, your teacher. He said, people were grateful to the rabbi because the father just brought him the world, and the rabbi took you to the world to come. At least that was a bit pure. So who takes you into the world to come? The Savior. Who changes not only what you do, but changes what you want to do. That's the gift Jesus gives to you and me. Gives us greatest honors. During the terrorist strike in Mumbai, I was at that hotel a few weeks later. They put plaques at the Kathamandu hotel and you go hotel there. Over private. And one of the Indians who was in the dining room the night it happened was being hosted by friends. He's an Indian-born English actor. And he was being interviewed on television. Here's what he said. He said, I heard the gunshots. I saw the spray of bullets. We all dove under the table to get cover. And as we were hiding under that table, he said, I knew I was covered in a pool of blood. All of my friends had been shot. They were all dead. And I was lying in this pile of bodies. And I heard the steps of the gunman coming towards us. And I heard him come and stop right next to me. And I could sense that barrel of the gun over me. And him staring down at me. I was so deathly afraid that I tried not even to breathe. And I walked away. So the interviewer said to him, why do you think we didn't kill you or all of your friends were dead? He said, I don't know, man. The only thing I can think of is I was so covered with another of my friends that he probably thought I was already dead. You and I are so covered through the blood of Christ that the enemy cannot destroy us anymore. We are forgiven. We are morality, accountability, and finally charity. We are living in a world of many, many differences. We have to learn to be loving in our differences, loving in our disagreements. We cannot be disagreeable in the way we present the disagreements. If you are disagreeable in the way you present your disagreements, what you believe instead of being global looks undesirable. In a loving way, we have to share the gospel, and the love in our hearts, we have to go out into the world of so many differences. Today the world has become a place of hate. All you've got to do is get onto the mass media and you see the anger, the hate, the bullying, all the nonsense that goes on. And the love of Christ is really the only answer in all of this. The love of Jesus Christ. He already said when he was being nailed to the cross, Father, forgive them, because they really don't know what they're doing. What an enormous gift of love, grace, and forgiveness. I'll close with this illustration. Some years ago, my wife and I were in Hawaii, and I had always wanted to go to the island of Molokai. I had heard a lot about it, but I'd never been there. We'd always generally gone to the Oahu, the Honolulu place, and then we've been there briefly, and then gone. So here we were now, looking for a place to go to that I really wanted to see. So we were in Oahu, and I wanted to go to Molokai. The reason I wanted to go to Molokai is because of a very famous Belgian missionary by the name of Joseph Damien. He left his own Belgium, went to Molokai years before, and he went not because he was called, but his brother was called to go, and his brother suddenly passed away, and his brother asked him if he would go in this place. So this short man, Joseph Damien, goes to Molokai, one of those beautiful islands, the world's highest sea cliffs, and he goes there. All the people from the Hawaiian Islands will never see the same thing. So he starts working on them. He taught his doctors and tries to find a cure for this, built a chapel, preached to them every day. They grew to love Damien. And one day Damien was falling well. some hot water from a kettle into a cup, and the water swirls on and falls onto his foot. To his shock, he realized he didn't feel it. He had a horrible feeling. He took the kettle, put a little bit on the other foot, and he didn't feel it. He knew what had happened. He contracted leprosy. That morning, when he went to speak to them in the chapel, he began with a very different line. All of them wondered why he did that. He always began by saying, my fellow believers. This morning he began by saying, my fellow lepers. He contracted leprosy. If you walk to Molokai, you see a grave where Daniel's grave markers. So he said to the man, is he buried here? He said, no, he was, but the body was taken away and the Belgian government wanted it back. But the people here pleaded the Belgian government, he loved us, they will not leave him here. They said, no, we want this hero back. So they asked the government, could they at least take that right hand off and bury the hand out there? So this was the hand that touched us. And he was alive. That hand is buried in Molokai as a reminder to them of the hand that touched them and the hand that loved them. In my office, I have a painting of a little girl holding the hands of Jesus, looking at it and saying, what happened to these hands? Because the nail mark is still there. And what happened to those hands is an expression of his love for you and for me. The least we can do is to represent that love as best as we can in a world torn by strife. Eternity, existence, morality, essence, accountability, conscience, charity, beneficence. Existence, essence, conscience, beneficence. Those are the four pillars defined by the Word of God that make you and me lights in a shining world. And the storms will come, and the rains will fall, and the winds will blow. But those who listen to His Word and keep it will build their house upon a rock. That's the foundation of eternity, morality, accountability, charity. May God richly bless you. Thank you for being here.